Imagine a black man cruising in a sleek luxury car. Every traffic rule followed to the letter. Yet Officer Brent smashes his fist against the window like he's cornering a wanted criminal. No cause. No reason, just raw prejudice cloaked in authority. Brent taunts, humiliates, and prods, itching for a reaction to justify the handcuffs he's dying to slap on. But this time, he's picked the wrong target. The man behind the wheel, Isaiah, harbors a secret so explosive it could topple Brent's corrupt precinct in one fell swoop. What happens when a rogue cop who thrives on silencing others finally meets his match? Stay glued to find out who truly holds the power. Isaiah's hands grip the leather steering wheel, knuckles taut under the dashboard's faint glow. The city lies hushed, a tense silence like the calm before a storm's first crack. The red light at the deserted intersection glares into his eyes, almost taunting him to move. His jaw tightens, a lone bead of sweat tracing a slow path from his temple, slipping beneath his crisp shirt collar. The Mercedes engine hums low, a steady pulse reverberating in his skull against the midnight quiet. Then, a blinding flash of blue and white rips through the dark as Brent's patrol car screeches to a halt, inches from Isaiah's bumper. The heavy door swings open with a thud that cuts the air like a blade. Brent strides out, boots hammering the pavement with deliberate menace. His flashlight flicks on, its beam a brutal slash across Isaiah's face, searing into his pupils until the veins in his eyes pulse like angry rivers. Isaiah doesn't blink. He draws a slow, deep breath, his chest rising like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Brent's lips curl into a sneer sharp enough to wound, his hand slamming the hood with a metallic bang that echoes like a challenge. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Echoing down the empty street, his other hand slid to his hip, fingers grazing the cold steel of his holstered gun. He leaned closer, breath sour with adrenaline and stale tobacco, and spat. A black man driving this kind of car? Who the do you think you are? The words cut through the night, each syllable a bullet. Isaiah's gaze lifted, meeting Brent's without a flicker of submission. His face stayed rigid, sculpted in defiance, the tension in his jaw ticking like a second hand counting down to detonation. Another bead of sweat slipped behind his ear, cold, against his skin, but his eyes, those eyes burned steady and sharp, fixed on the man trying to break him. Brent's fingers drummed on the window, each tap a taunt. A countdown to an inevitable collision. The air between them crackled with static, their breaths shallow and ragged like two predators circling the same kill. Brent growled low in his throat, a sound more animal than human, then slammed his fist against the glass, rattling it so hard Isaiah could feel it vibrate in his bones. License and registration now. Brent barked, voice thick with venom. It wasn't a request, it was an execution order. A demand dripping with the arrogant assumption of total control. Isaiah's lips twitched, a movement so slight it could have been mistaken for a tick, but then it unfolded into a razor-thin smile. The corners of his mouth lifted just enough to flash a hint of teeth, as though he were savoring some private joke. Brent would never understand. The night pressed tighter around them, the traffic signal above bleeding its red glow into the scene like a wound refusing to close. Isaiah's fingers tapped the steering wheel once, twice, then stilled. His head turned slowly, deliberately, until his gaze locked onto Brent with an intensity that felt like it could peel the skin right off his skull. Finally, Isaiah's voice broke the silence, low and smooth, but carrying a dangerous undercurrent that crawled under the skin. You sure? The question sliced the air, casual in sound, but loaded like a cocked pistol. Brent's eyes widened, caught off guard for half a second before they narrowed into slits of pure hatred. His knuckles whitened. Around the flashlight, the beam wavering just enough to catch the shimmer of sweat across Isaiah's brow. The moment stretched long and thin, threatening to snap. Isaiah didn't move, didn't blink. His spine stayed rigid against the seat, his chest rising and falling in a measured, deliberate rhythm. The entire world had collapsed into this intersection, this red light, this single confrontation. No bystanders, no witnesses, only two men, one too hungry for power to see his weakness, the other too strong to bow even under the threat of death. Isaiah's smile faded as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a mask of stone. The heat from the car's engine pulsed beneath his feet, the faint tick of the cooling metal under the hood echoing Brent's restless fingers. The cop's breath fogged. Against the window, each puff a ghostly accusation, a promise of violence hanging in the stale midnight air. Brent shifted his weight forward, his body language screaming dominance. But Isaiah's silence stabbed deeper than any insult. It was an insult of its kind, a refusal to cower, to tremble, to give even an inch. Brent's veins bulged at his temples, rage painting his skin a livid red. The echo of his heartbeat roared in his ears, mixing with the mechanical whine of the street lights and the low, almost imperceptible hum of Isaiah's car still idling like a panther, ready to pounce. Brent's mouth curled again, ready to spit another curse, another order meant to break Isaiah's spirit. But Isaiah only watched, that faint smirk still ghosting at the edges of his lips, his eyes glinting with something Brent couldn't name. Something dangerous, unbowed, electric. In that suspended heartbeat, under the sterile glare of the traffic signal and the harsh stab of Brent's flashlight, the balance of power flickered. For one charged instant, it was no longer Brent holding the leash. It was Isaiah holding his patience like a blade, sharp and hidden, waiting for the right moment to cut. And in that moment, everything else ceased to exist. The thin smile on Isaiah's face from the previous moment lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Sharp and accurate yet impossibly controlled, without breaking that cold electric gaze. He pushed the car door open and stepped out, movements fluid, deliberate, each gesture echoing a silent authority that refused to beg. His polished shoes landed softly on the asphalt, catching the faint shimmer of the street light like a blade unshathing. He straightened his spine, exhaled slowly, and in one smooth motion, he lifted his hands to the collar, fingers gliding over the crisp fabric before tugging his tie into perfect alignment. The vest hugged his frame like a quiet fortress, each button a silent oath of restraint and promise of devastation. Brent's laugh sliced through the night, jagged and mean like nails on raw flesh. He moved fast to breathe, hand shooting out to yank Isaiah's tie with savage force, dragging him forward until his back crashed against the car's burning hood. The searing metal bit through the thin barrier of his vest, branding his chest with a violent pulse that made sweat bloom instantly across his skin. Brent's face hovered inches from Isaiah's, eyes glittering with the joy of domination, of watching something noble forced into the dirt. His breath stank of cheap whiskey and rotten ego, a toxic blend that stung more than the heat against Isaiah's sternum. Without hesitation, Brent reached into Isaiah's inner pocket, ripped out his wallet, and flung it down onto the gritty asphalt. The wallet landed with a hollow smack, leather folding awkwardly, exposing crisp cards and folded bills like a wounded animal spilling guts. Brent lifted his boot with exaggerated slowness, letting the sole hover a second over the wallet, as if savoring the anticipation, then slammed it down hard. The crack of pressure echoed like a gunshot, a cruel punctuation mark on his sneer. This, Brent spat, voice laced with venom and mockery as he ground his heel deeper, leaving a smear of dirt and oil across the once pristine leather. This is exactly where you belong. Down here. His words oozed with a twisted pride, each syllable twisting like a serrated knife against dignity. Isaiah's eyes dropped briefly, scanning the crumpled wallet, and for a flicker of a second, his jaw flexed tight, a subtle twitch that carried more weight than 1,000 curses. He bent forward with mechanical grace, picking up the wallet with 2 fingers, as if handling something diseased. His eyes flicked up quick as a snake strike, locking on Brent's face with a glare so sharp it felt like it could flay the smugness right off his skin. In that glance, a storm brewed behind the surface, calm, a thunderclap waiting to split the sky. Brent laughed again, a harsh barking sound that cracked the night. He tilted his head, lips curling into a snarl of pure disdain, and let his fingers slide mockingly down the line of Isaiah's tie before giving it another jerk for show. Black men always end up on their knees, he hissed, leaning so close the spit almost touched Isaiah's cheek. That's the safest place for you. Under my boot. Where you belong. Isaiah didn't respond. His breath came slow, measured, each inhale, stretching his ribs against the scorched fabric like a silent drumbeat of defiance. His eyes, twin shards of obsidian, never wavered, absorbing every ounce of Brent's hatred without blinking. The air clung to them, heavy with sweat, burnt rubber, and the electric scent of rising rage. The heat radiating from the car seeped deeper into Isaiah's bones, fusing pain into a molten resolve. Brent's fingers lingered on his tie, as though trying to milk every drop of humiliation from the gesture. But Isaiah's stillness twisted the power dynamic in a way Brent was too drunk on his cruelty to recognize. Every heartbeat beneath Isaiah's skin thrummed with a dangerous patience, each pulse a silent mantra echoing through his veins. Not yet. Isaiah's hand closed slowly around the wallet, leather now marred by Brent's filthy tread. The imprints of a power grab, that wire of cowardice. The moonlight traced the edges of the embossed initials now stained and scuffed. A ghostly testament to an identity Brent believed he had reduced to ash. Yet in the depths of Isaiah's eyes, there was no crack, no fracture, only a terrifying steadiness that promised storms to come. Brent straightened, stepping back with a swagger born from years of unchecked authority. His laughter now a rasping echo bouncing down the deserted street. He admired his handiwork, chest puffed, convinced he had reduced the man before him to dust. But in that final silent exchange, Isaiah stood taller, even pressed against the molten hood, a living contradiction that mocked every word Brent had spat. The car's metal seared into his back, but he did not shift, did not bow, did not give the trembling Brent the satisfaction of a flinch. Instead, he exhaled, the sound low, calm, carrying the chilling promise of a reckoning that Brent was too blind to see. In that pause, under the lonely glare of the street light, the balance trembled on a knife's edge, and somewhere deep in Brent's reptilian brain, a flicker of uncertainty sparked, too small to name, but enough to leave a shadow. Isaiah's gaze never wavered, the corners of his lips barely hinting at a smirk, as if he knew a secret Brent could never touch. And though Brent believed he was the executioner tonight, he didn't realize he had just laid the first stone for his ruin. Isaiah's fingers closed around the battered wallet, the weight of Brent's filth still pulsing through the leather like a silent brand. His breathing stayed even, a smooth tide against the sharp edges of Brent's contempt. Without breaking eye contact, he lifted his head ever so slightly, as if listening to some secret melody drifting through the heavy night air. The movement was so subtle, so precise, it felt more like a whisper than a motion. Then, almost imperceptibly, his thumb slipped under the edge of his collar and pressed a hidden button on his lapel. A minuscule green light sparked to life near the seam, a soft, venomous glow in the darkness, a quiet rebellion flickering beneath the surface. The glow didn't belong to the world of sirens and bruised egos. It belonged to a colder realm, one where every second was evidence. Every word a loaded weapon. Ben didn't notice at first. He was too intoxicated by the illusion of power, too lost in the echo of his venom. His hand shot out again, grabbing Isaiah's lapel with a violent yank that nearly tore the seam, revealing for a heartbeat a glimpse of a fabric tag, a small cryptic emblem. Grant's eyes narrowed, confusion slashing across his face like a quick knife. His fingers paused, trembled for a fleeting instant, but then he scoffed, brushing off the moment like lint on his uniform. His smirk crawled back onto his lips, curling, in a twisted, jagged line that dripped arrogance. As eyes sharpened in that split-second window, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth like a phantom smirk, not of amusement, but of an unspoken threat. His gaze bored into Brent, dissecting him molecule by molecule, peeling back every layer of bravado and rot beneath. The heat from the car still licked his back, sweat now trailing in precise lines down his spine, but his face remained carved from obsidian, cold, unyielding, silently lethal. Brent leaned in closer, a predator savoring the illusion of control. His fist lifted and came down in a quick calculated jab into Isaiah's chest, not hard enough to bruise, but enough to punctuate the words that oozed out like poison. His breath riot of stale cigarettes and festering hate, a rancid fog that clung to Isaiah's skin. Only you, Brent spat, each syllable a dagger dipped in. Bile, only you would think you're different. The punch wasn't meant to hurt flesh. It was meant to maim the soul, to chip away at dignity. One blow at a time, Isaiah didn't recoil. His body absorbed the impact like a stone absorbs rain, unmoved, indifferent, storing every drop for a future flood. His lips parted, the air around them humming with an almost electric anticipation, and he spoke so softly that it slid under Brent's skin like a whispering razor. "I am different," he said. The words heavy with a truth so sharp it gleamed even in the gloom. The phrase didn't ask permission. It didn't seek validation. It announced itself as a quiet prophecy, a seed planted in the marrow of the moment, promising a bloom Brent was too blind to fear yet. Brent's jaw twitched, his eyes flashing. But he laughed, the sound brittle and wild, bouncing around the empty intersection like broken glass. His fingers clenched tighter around Isaiah's shirt, veins bulging along his wrist, as though his very blood rebelled against his delusion. The green light at Isaiah's collar winked again, unnoticed, a tiny serpent, coiled and waiting. Isaiah's eyes flicked to it for a fraction of a breath, his gaze shifting back up to meet Brant's with a patience that felt inhuman, almost celestial in its immovable calm. The world around them contracted to this brutal ballet, to men locked in a silent war where every inhale and exhale counted as artillery fire. The city, the red light, the night sky, all dissolved, leaving only the symphony of shallow breaths, the acidic stench of Brent's rage, and the glimmer of a hidden weapon, more dangerous than any gun. Isaiah's chin lifted by a hair's breadth, the movement so deliberate it cut the tension like a scalpel. His eyes never flinched, absorbing the echo of Brett's laughter as though memorizing it for some distant icy ledger. Beneath the skin, every muscle in Isaiah's frame coiled, but on the surface he was stillness personified, an enigma so dense it threatened to collapse in on itself. Burns' breath faltered for a split second, a hiccup of instinct that he buried quickly under another surge of cruelty. The smirk on Isaiah's face edged closer to a sneer. Not wide, not loud, but a precise incision across Brent's illusion of dominance. Isaiah's silence spoke a language Brent couldn't read. Each unspoken word a steel spike hammered into his arrogance. In that microsecond, the balance shifted by a hair, almost imperceptible, yet seismic to anyone who knew where to look. Isaiah's whispered admission, "I am different," hung between them like a blade suspended in air, gleaming, promising blood. Brent, too drunk on his toxicity to hear the undertones, smirked wider, convinced he had broken the man before him. But in Isaiah's stillness, the real violence brewed, a violence without fists, without bullets, yet lethal beyond measure. And, though Brent saw only a man beneath his grip, the truth stared him down through obsidian eyes. A storm gathering in absolute silence, preparing to devour him whole. The ghost of Isaiah's words, "I'm different," still vibrated in the air like a tuning fork struck in a cathedral. Brent's eyes burned with a twisted delight, feeding off the illusion that his grip had finally crushed the spirit behind that obsidian gaze. Without a second's hesitation, Brent shoved Isaiah downward, hands clawing at his shoulders, forcing a brutal downward motion that would have shattered a lesser man. Isaiah's knees bent slightly, muscles taut, calves coiled like steel, springs beneath the pressed lines of his trousers. But he didn't collapse. Instead, he absorbed the force, each tendon singing with silent defiance, every fiber of his frame resisting the grotesque dance Brent tried to orchestrate. Brent's face contorted with glee and madness as he pressed a knee against Isaiah's back, the weight driving down like an avalanche, trying to reduce him to dust on the blacktop. Brent leaned forward, voice dropping into a low, primal growl that dripped venom and cruelty. "You kneel now, or I snap your spine like a twig," he snarled. Every word a toxic brand against the night air. The heat from the car's engine rose around them, steam merging with the sweat that poured from Isaiah's temples, each droplet carving a burning trail down to the edge of his jawline. The mirrored surface of the car window caught Isaiah's eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't break. His gaze locked onto his reflection, a silent communion with the warrior staring back. A man carved from storms and midnight steel. His lips pressed into a line so tight it looked carved from stone. His shoulder shifted minutely under Brent's knee, a subtle redistribution of force that transformed him from prey into a loaded weapon. Each breath was a controlled detonation, air sucked in to feed the silent fire roaring behind his ribs. Brent's fingers dug harder, his knee pushing in cruel angles, veins bulging at his temples with the ecstasy of false victory. "I am the law." "Here," Brent spat, voice pitched into a cracked snarl that cut through the night like a whip. "Do you understand that, do you? For a heartbeat?" The world shrank to the tremor of Isaiah's diaphragm, the whisper of blood surging beneath his skin, the thunder of his pulse echoing in the chasm between defiance and surrender. He didn't speak at first. Silence stretched, elastic and sharp. Each second, a blade pressed closer to Brent's fragile sense of control. Then Isaiah's jaw flexed, his murs grinding as if chewing on the taste of the moment. His eyes narrowed, scanning the reflective surface before him, as if memorizing every nuance of his stance, every molecule of resistance that shimmered in the tension around them. Finally, his lips parted, voice emerging low, razor sharp, sound more akin to an ancient drumbeat than human speech. "I understand," he breathed, the words sliding through the air like oil on steel. Another pause, heavy as an executioner's axe. Then he continued, softer yet more lethal than a bullet to the skull. "Perfectly." Brandt's nostrils flared, a rush of mad triumph flooding his expression. He believed he had won, that he had bent the unbreakable, but beneath his knee, Isaiah's muscles tremored, not in submission, but in coiled fury. Each vibration a signal of the seismic reckoning gathering in his bones. Brandt's breath fell onto Isaiah's neck, hot and rancid, the stench of a predator who had mistaken his prey for a lamb instead of a panther waiting to strike. The street light above them flickered once, the brief darkness reflecting in Isaiah's eyes as an omen, a glimpse of something colossal and unstoppable, lurking just beyond Brent's grasp. Isaiah inhaled deeply, his rib cage expanding beneath Brent's, a press of weight, skin pulling tight over the silent promise of violence yet to come. Every muscle along his spine aligned like the chambers of a revolver, each vertebrae ready to snap back with explosive force. His hands hovered near the pavement, fingers barely grazing the rough surface, but his balance stayed unbroken. A masterclass in restraint masquerading as defeat. His heart thundered with measured cadence, each beat a countdown to the moment Brent's illusion would fracture beyond repair. In the final stillness, the night pressed closer, holding its breath alongside Isaiah. Brent hissed one last time, "Stay down," his words trembling at the edges with manic anticipation. Isaiah's lips quivered for a heartbeat, then pressed shut again, the ghost of a smirk playing at their edges as he focused on the reflection before him, his true self, unbent, unbowed, alive with an ancient power Brent would never comprehend. The night around them didn't move, didn't dare intrude on the quiet violence, coiling like a serpent in Isaiah's chest. His exhale was long, slow, a final note in a silent symphony of defiance, his voice emerging so quietly that Brent almost had to lean closer to hear it. "I understand," Isaiah repeated, the words now stripped of any veneer, echoing from some sacred forge within his soul, crystal clear. In that instant, though Brent still pressed down, though he still roared about law and dominance, the truth had already shifted. Isaiah remained standing in spirit, a titan disguised in human skin, his power humming beneath Brent's ignorance. And as Brent clung to his illusion, Isaiah's reflection in the glass stared back at him, calm, merciless, and infinitely patient. A mirror Brent would one day shatter himself against, without ever knowing when the first crack began. Isaiah's reflection still glared back from the car window, an unwavering phantom standing taller than the man force half to his knees. Brent pressed down harder, knuckles whitening against Isaiah's shoulders, his breath coming in ragged spurts filled with rancid heat and frenzied hate. But beneath that crushing knee, something shifted. Isaiah's shoulders tremored, not in weakness, but like a mountain rumbling before an earthquake. Then, breaking the night's suffocating grip, a sound escaped Isaiah's lips, a low chuckle, smooth as obsidian, sliding through flesh. It wasn't loud, but it echoed with a devastating resonance, reverberating through Brent's bones, as if some ancient beast had stirred beneath the surface. Brent froze, his grip faltering just enough to betray a splinter of fear he didn't understand. The laugh slithered around him, wrapping the humid air in an invisible coil that squeezed tighter with each second. Brent snarled, trying to bury that momentary weakness under another surge of aggression. He shoved again, this time with more force, his fingers clawing deeper into the fabric at Isaiah's shoulders, but his hands began to tremble, a microscopic quake betraying the tectonic shift beneath his borrowed authority. Isaiah's head tilted up, slow and deliberate, each inch punctuated by an exhale that sounded more like a war drum than breath. His eyes snapped to Brent's face, slicing through the darkness, pupils so sharp they seemed to pierce straight into Brent's corrupted marrow. Then came Isaiah's words, measured, calm, yet so heavy they seemed to weigh the entire street down with them. "You know," Isaiah murmured, voice low and intimate, as though sharing a secret in a confession booth. "Power doesn't live in that badge you cling to." Brent's face contorted into a grotesque mask, veins pulsing along his forehead, his lips twisting into a snarl dripping with desperation. "Shut up," he roared, voice cracking under the strain of fragile pride. "I can shoot you right now. I can end this. You hear me?" The threat cracked like a faulty whip, flailing wildly instead of cutting clean. Brent's hand twitched toward his holster, the promise of violence trembling in the muggy air like lightning trapped in a storm cloud. Yet even as he roared, the tremor in his wrists betrayed him. Each vibration and unspoken confession, he was no longer in control. Isaiah didn't flinch, his lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer, a ghost of triumph flickering just beneath the surface of absolute composure. His spine straightened another fraction, spine muscles rolling under the thin fabric like coiled cables. The heat from the engine rose in his chest, igniting a silent blaze within him that illuminated every word he was about to deliver. His eyes never left Brent, to black suns pulling in every ounce of false bravado and burning it to ash. "Go ahead," Isaiah whispered, each syllable falling with the weight of a dropped hammer. "Shoot." The word snapped like a guillotine blade in the humid night, a pause sharp as a blade's edge. Then, with a breath so calm it could have come from a saint or a god, he continued, "You'll finally learn who's really in control." The sentence landed with surgical precision, carving through Brent's last fragile illusions like acid on paper. Brent's breath hitched, pupils dilating, his pulse throbbing visibly along his neck as though his body understood what his ego refused to accept. For a fleeting heartbeat, he saw it, the abyss behind Isaiah's words, the vast, cold expanse of something he could never dominate, could never even fully perceive. His finger hovered near the trigger, but his entire arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, pinned by an invisible force born not of muscle, but of sheer unyielding will. Isaiah stayed perfectly still, his control so total it radiated out in shock waves, warping the space around them. His silence screamed louder than any bullet ever could. Brent's chest heaved as though he'd been running miles uphill, his face losing color under the realization that his threats were no longer weapons, but pitiful echoes bouncing off an immovable wall. A single bead of sweat fell from Brent's temple, landing on Isaiah's sleeve, disappearing without a trace, symbolic of Brent's fading dominance. Isaiah watched that moment, eyes unblinking, the slight shift at the corner of his lips hinting at something lethal coiled just beneath the surface. Not rage, but a clarity that promised devastation. In that stifling hush, the roles between predator and prey inverted completely, so seamlessly that Brent barely registered the collapse. The street remained still, a stage frozen mid-scene, the red glow of the traffic light overhead, like a final verdict, passed in crimson ink. Brent's breathing grew shallow, each exhale a brittle gasp scratching at the edges of panic. Isaiah, meanwhile, seemed to draw strength from every pulse. Every terrified twitch in Brent's fingers, every echo of his faltering authority. He embodied a different kind of violence. The violence of a hurricane eye, the promise of obliteration, and serene calm. Brent stood there, fingers still grazing the grip of his gun, but paralyzed by the silent truth looming before him. He was no longer the executioner, he was the condemned, staring helplessly into the abyss Isaiah had become. Isaiah's final words still coiled in the air, venomous and patient, a ghost of power Brent could neither see nor kill. Brent's rage, now tinged with the acidic taste of fear, surged in a frantic, final attempt to reclaim dominance. With a violent shove, he tore his hands from Isaiah and pushed him backward so hard the night itself seemed to stagger. Isaiah's body shifted gracefully, his shoes scraping the asphalt in a controlled slide rather than a stumble. His balance, even when forced, stayed immaculate. His posture echoing a predator brushing off a mosquito rather than a victim nursing wounds. Brent's hand shot down, grabbing Isaiah's papers, flinging them toward the street like worthless debris. His voice tearing out in a raw, cracking scream. "Get thee out of here. Don't ever let me see your face again." His words, spit-laced and trembling, ricocheted off the silent buildings, sounding more like a plea than a command. The papers fluttered in the air, catching a faint breeze before spiraling to the ground in a dance that mocked Brent's hysteria. Isaiah didn't rush to retrieve them. Instead, he paused, straightening his vest with precise, almost surgical care. His fingers flicked imaginary dust from the lapels, each gesture dripping with disdain to need words. Then, a faint razor-thin smile ghosted across his lips. A smile sharp enough to peel skin. He tilted his head just enough to lock eyes with Brent through the blackness, his voice cutting through the humid night like a scalpel. "Oh, you'll see me again," Isaiah said, each syllable delivered with a composure so icy could have frozen the sweat on Brent's forehead. Very soon, Brent flinched, an involuntary twitch that betrayed the tiny fracture already webbing through his once impenetrable armor. He slammed the cruiser door, metal screaming in protest. The echo a jarring exclamation point to his unraveling authority. His eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror, desperate to confirm Isaiah's retreat. But there he was, still standing, still impossibly straight, still calmly adjusting his tie as if preparing for a gala rather than recovering from a physical assault. Brent's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his pulse pounding against the tight collar of his uniform. A bead of sweat slipped past his temple, trailing down his cheek in a single shiver of primal dread. He swallowed hard, the sour taste of bile mixing with the metallic tang of fear. He twisted the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, a hollow beast no longer offering comfort, but echoing his internal chaos. Outside, Isaiah stood motionless, a living monument to unbroken will. His hands moved with elegant precision as he reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone that gleamed beneath the streetlight like an executioner's blade. His thumb hovered above the screen for a fraction of a second, then pressed with clinical finality. "A 7B, he murmured, voice low for Brent to hear, but powerful enough to ripple the night itself. Opened the file. The screen lit up in an ethereal glow, illuminating Isaiah's face from below, casting his features in ghostly relief. In that light, his eyes looked almost otherworldly. Endless pools of cold resolve, Brant's foot mashed the gas pedal, and the cruiser jolted forward in a spasm of desperation rather than strategy. Yet, even through the accelerating blur, Brant risked one last glance into the mirror. The sight he caught hollowed out his lungs. Isaiah standing perfectly still, tie immaculately adjusted, phone glowing like an ominous star in the dark. A shudder racked Brent's spine, his hands momentarily slipping on the wheel. The adrenaline that once made him feel invincible now curdled into something feral and uncontrollable. A new word began to carve itself into his mind, not dominance, not control, but exposure, and it festered there, a black seed he couldn't scrape away. Isaiah watched the cruiser's taillights shrink into the distance, his face unreadable, untouched by the retreat. He lowered the phone slightly, the glow now a quiet sentinel against the shadows. Then, with a casual flick of his fingers, he closed the app and slid the device back into his pocket as though nothing had happened. His hands returned to his vest, smoothing the fabric with gentle finality, sealing the moment like a signature on an unseen contract. In the silence that followed, the street seemed to exhale around him, the tension breaking in a hush that only made his presence feel even more absolute. Isaiah rolled his neck slowly, vertebrae clicking like the cocking of a distant rifle, his body language serene, yet humming with latent violence, ready to be unleashed. The night no longer pressed against him. It recoiled, making space for the quiet storm, taking human form in his silhouette. Above, the red light turned green. But Isaiah didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already shifted the game board, flipped every hidden piece, planted the first move of a war Brent had no idea he'd already lost. And as he stood beneath the glow, his words echoed in the dark like an oath. "You'll see me very soon." The echo of Isaiah's last words still shimmered in the night as he moved away from the street, each step a silent drumbeat of finality. The city swallowed him into its obsidian veins. But he carried the glow of authority like a hidden ember. Minutes later, he stepped through an unmarked door into a pitch-black room where silence didn't just exist, it ruled. The walls felt alive, humming with the low current of concealed power, and the air was heavy with the cold scent of steel and secrets. Isaiah flicked on a single switch. A large screen flared to life at the far end, the federal emblem burning into view, its eagle wings spread wide as if poised to strike. The harsh blue light bathed his face in a cold luminance, carving his features into sharp relief, a face that had been a mask all night, now returning to its true unmasked state. Without hesitation, he slipped a hand to the top button of his shirt, popping it open with a fluid, practiced motion. His fingers moved to his vest, slipping beneath the fabric to extract a gleaming silver badge. The polished surface caught the electric glow, reflecting a truth that had been sheathed until now. Etched into the badge were the words, "Special, Investigator." Below them, a number as cold and final as a gravestone chisel. 72. Isaiah set the badge down beside the keyboard with reverence, a silent ritual before war. He leaned forward, fingers flying across the keys as if each tap were a bullet shot into Brent's destiny. The screen filled with footage, raw, unfiltered slices of humiliation and venom. Isaiah paused, zooming in on Brent's face mid-sneer, the rage twisting his mouth into a grotesque snarl. He dragged the cursor closer, freezing on Brent's dilated pupils and twitching jawline. The cold blue light flickered across Isaiah's eyes, and he murmured to himself, each word a scalpel. Mental state, stable, manipulative tendencies, extreme. He paused, his gaze drilling into the frozen image on the screen. His lips parted in a whisper so soft it might have been mistaken for a prayer, though there was nothing divine in its delivery. "You signed your execution order tonight," he breathed, the sentence curling through the darkness like a viper, cold and merciless. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. The icy resolve emanated from his body like a sub-zero wind slicing through flesh. Meanwhile, miles away, Brent gripped the steering wheel with a desperation that bordered on feral. The cruiser swerved slightly, tires skidding across the slick pavement, as if the vehicle itself recoiled from its driver's unraveling mind. Brent's eyes darted back and forth, every shadow now a phantom echo of Isaiah's unwavering gaze. Sweat dripped from his forehead in relentless streams, soaking the collar of his uniform and turning the starched fabric into a prison of damp panic. His breath roared inside the cabin, ragged and uneven, each inhale a strangled plea for air that refused to come easily. His knuckles bleached white as he strangled the wheel, the synthetic leather creaking under his iron grip. He tried to shake it off. The look, the words, the promise in Isaiah's eyes, but they burned brighter than the street lights blaring past his windshield. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth arced, grinding down like millstones, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Back in the room, Isaiah stood motionless after finishing his notes, his silhouette carved in shadows and neon. He moved with an eerie tranquility, every step measured as if he were traversing sacred ground. He reached for the badge again, turning it slowly between his fingers, the silver catching brief flashes of code and data flickering on the monitor behind him. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a blade, a verdict waiting to descend. Isaiah glanced one final time at Brant's image, letting the silence expand, fill the room like rising water, heavy enough to drown the faintest whisper of doubt. Then he set the badge down with a deliberate click, a sound ringing out like a gavel striking down a sentence. He leaned closer to the screen, face inches away from Brent's frozen snarl, his breath fogging the edge of the monitor for a split second before vanishing. In that mist, a single truth was written. Dominance had changed hands, and Brent had yet to understand the scale of his collapse. Outside, Brent's world continued to spiral. He roared curses into the void of the empty road, his voice cracking, breaking, dissolving into something less than human. The shadows seemed to dance at the edges of his vision, each one morphing into Isaiah's poised silhouette, a ghostly reminder that his once untouchable badge meant nothing. Now, Isaiah straightened at last, fingers sweeping the badge back into his vest pocket as he killed the monitor's glow. The room plunged back into darkness, but Isaiah remained illuminated from within, his mind all light with the strategy of the coming storm. In that black void, he whispered a single phrase, barely louder than breath, but slicing sharper than any. "Blade, you'll meet me in your nightmares first." The echo of Isaiah's whisper still haunted the sterile dark as Brent stumbled into the station, his breath a ragged saw cutting through the stale air. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered like nervous insects, casting his twitching shadow along the hallway walls. His boots slapped against the linoleum with frantic, uneven beats, his movements no longer holding the crisp authority of a uniformed officer, but the stumbling panic of a hunted animal. He crashed into the file room, the metal door creaking on hinges that seemed to scream with him. His hands, slick with sweat, fumbled at the cabinet lock before he yanked it open so hard it nearly toppled forward. His eyes darted, feverish and bloodshot, until they locked onto a single envelope taped to the inside wall of the cabinet. The paper seemed to glow with a malevolent light. The bold black letters like a gash across flesh. Internal Affairs Investigation. Subject: You. Brent's pupils shrank to pinpoints. His fingers clawed the envelope free, ripping it open so violently he tore part of the header off. His gaze devoured the words inside, each line a nail hammered into his spine. The reality struck, like a sledgehammer. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He wasn't even the guard dog. He was the quarry. Naked and alone in a killing field, he thought he ruled. His lips peeled back in a feral snarl and he roared, voice breaking and echoing off the cold, sterile tile. Who did this? Who dared? His fist slammed into the wall beside the cabinet, plaster fracturing under the raw violence, white dust puffing into the air like bone ash. Blood bloomed across his knuckles, but he didn't feel it. He only felt the raw, icy invasion of fear, crawling beneath his skin. Suddenly, the security monitors flickered on, static crawling across the screens before resolving into a single searing image. There, framed in cold monochrome, stood Isaiah, the same Isaiah who hours ago had been beneath his knee, silent and still as stone, now filled the screen with an aura that radiated quiet annihilation. His eyes were twin scalpels slicing through the cheap plastic lens as if it were flesh. His jaw set in a line of absolute uncheckable resolve. Even through the screen, his presence expanded to fill the room, crowding out air and light, suffocating Brent in a silence more deafening than a riot. Brent staggered backward, the letter slipping from his grip and spiraling to the ground like a mortally wounded bird. He fumbled for his phone, fingers slipping off the glass, each failed attempt tightening the noose around his sanity. He finally jabbed at the call icon, thumb trembling, sweat smearing across the screen. The line clicked. Nothing, only a single endless beep. He tried again, dialing his superior's number with frantic urgency, each digit a prayer scratched into the void again, nothing but a hollow, mocking tone that stretched on and on, echoing the yawning abyss in his chest. On the monitor, Isaiah shifted slightly, enough to make Brent flinch as though struck. The stillness in Isaiah's expression was not the stillness of a man lacking options, but the stillness of a man who no longer needed any. A stillness that spoke of executioners and guillotines, a verdict long written and only now delivered. Brent's voice splintered into gasps and choked cursed. He kicked the fallen letter, the paper skidding across the floor like a discarded verdict, but it could not outrun the words burning into his skull. Isaiah leaned closer to the camera, the motion almost imperceptible, yet it commanded the room, like a tidal wave. His eyes narrowed, a scalpel's edge of disdain shining through. Then, in a voice so calm it felt inhuman, he spoke. "The way you look at me now, it's different, isn't it?" The words landed like blades, each syllable puncturing Brent's pretense of power, each pause a gaping wound. Brent's breath hitched, an ugly stuttering inhale that cracked through the static-laden air. He shook his head in a wild, almost childlike denial. But the image on the monitor didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't grant him the mercy of even a heartbeat's reprieve. Brent's mouth opened, but no words emerged, only ragged, guttural noises that dissolved into the sterile hum of the empty station. Isaiah didn't need to raise his voice. The gravity in his whisper outweighed any scream Brent could have thrown back. The badge, the walls, the gun at his side, all worthless relics in that moment. Isaiah's presence swallowed them whole, leaving Brent naked under a cosmic coldness he could neither name nor escape. Tremor rocked Brent's knees, his body pitched forward, palms slapping against the blood-smeared wall as he heaved for air. His entire world had narrowed to one camera, one voice, one judge. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt, every second, stretching into an eternity of judgment. Isaiah didn't need to say more. The silence was the true sentence. A living organism crawling through Brent's veins, coiling around his spine, whispering of inevitability. In that final stare between hunter and hunted, Brent realized far too late that he had been reduced to prey long before he even touched Isaiah's tie. And across the screen, Isaiah simply watched, his eyes a dark mirror in which Brent could see the reflection of a man already buried. The sterile hush of the station remained heavy, a suffocating blanket Brent could neither throw off nor ignore. His ragged gasps still reverberated off the walls when somewhere deep in the bellows of the surveillance system, a new hum awakened, sharp, electric, and surgical in its precision. Brent lifted his head, trembling, as the monitors around him flickered once more. The screens bloomed to life, each one a window into his private darkness, now thrown into the blinding light. Isaiah's hand appeared first on the largest screen, gloved fingers gliding across a tablet surface with the same cold finesse as a surgeon prepping for a final cut. Then came the footage, Brent's face twisted and rabid, frozen mid-sneer, his voice echoing back at him in a hateful loop. Brent staggered forward, eyes widening in raw horror as he watched the scenes he thought belonged to the shadows now projected. With clinical clarity, each cruel word he had spat. "Black people drive like this. Black people always kneel," looped back in crisp audio, each syllable now a nail in his mental coffin. Isaiah had chosen every frame with almost sacred precision, showcasing Brent's spittle-flecked rage, the venomous curl of his lips, the delighted violence in his eye. The lute played again, then again, each repetition stripping layers off Brent's mind like skin from bone. Brent's throat clicked dryly, his lips parting, but failing to form any coherent plea. He lifted a trembling hand as if to touch the screen, as though he could wipe the evidence away like condensation on glass. But the images remained, immutable and damning, each pixel a blade. Brent's knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor with a hollow thud that echoed around the room like a final empty drum beat. On the center screen, Isaiah's face finally emerged from the dark. His expression was a master class in lethal calm, his eyes shimmering with an intelligence so cold it could fossilize oceans. He leaned in, filling the frame until it seemed he might step directly into the room. The room seemed to contract around Brant's ragged breath as Isaiah's voice sliced through, quiet and exacting. "Who did you think I was earlier?" Isaiah asked. His tone conversational, almost casual, but each word carried. The force of an anvil dropped into Brant's chest. Brant's head snapped up, his mouth gaping, teeth bared like a cornered animal. His voice tore from his throat raw and ragged, more a scream than speech. "You're not human, you're a demon." His spit splattered against the cold tile, his body convulsing in a grotesque ballet of panic and hate. He clawed at the floor, fingers scraping so hard they left shallow, bloody tracks across the linoleum. Isaiah's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk, though the warmth of amusement never touched his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, as if inspecting Brent like a scientist observing a failed experiment. Then, in a whisper sharp enough to flood Brent's last shreds of pride, he responded, "A demon for whom?" Think carefully. The phrase hung there, suspended in the sterile air like a blade waiting to fall. The weight of it pushed deeper than any physical blow. A psychological incision Brent could not cauterize. Brent's entire body spasmed, his back arching in a futile animalistic attempt to escape words that now felt like shackles. The images behind Isaiah looped again, Brent's insults echoing in an unholy chorus that filled every crevice of the room. The monitor's light painted Brent's sweat-soaked face in pale, sickly shades, transforming him into something spectral, something already half consumed by the abyss he had so gleefully dug for others. Isaiah did not blink. He did not move. His presence through the screen exuded such suffocating control that even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to dim in reverence. Brant's voice cracked again, his pleas now reduced to incoherent stutters and shrieks, his fingers clawing at his uniform as if trying to peel the guilt from his skin. But there was no escape, no door to bolt, no superior to call, only Isaiah, only the footage, only the truth laid bare in brutal, merciless high definition. Isaiah allowed the silence to stretch, weaponizing the void between each syllable. He watched Brent disintegrate molecule by molecule, savoring each collapse, each involuntary twitch, each spasm of self-loathing. Isaiah's whisper finally returned, the sound so soft it forced Brent to crawl closer to the screen like a dying man begging for water. "Remember," Isaiah breathed, each consonant articulated with scalpel precision. "I didn't create this version of you. You did. I simply turned on the light." Brent's final sob tore free, his forehead hitting the cold floor with a dull crack that reverberated as a pitiful echo through the sterile, now sacred chamber of his undoing. And on the screen, Isaiah leaned back slightly, eyes fixed, as if already studying the next move. In a game only he knew how to win, Brent's final sobs still echoed in the sterile room when a different kind of silence descended. A silence not born of fear, but of arrival. It was a hush so absolute that it seemed to peel the paint from the walls to freeze the air in Brent's lungs. The door at the far end of the station creaked open, its hinges shrieking in protest as though they to sense the finality stepping across the threshold. And then he appeared. Isaiah walked forward, dressed in an impeccably tailored black vest, each step carving into the ground with the weight of an unspoken verdict. The silver badge gleamed on his chest, catching the harsh overhead lights and turning them into a cold halo that framed his face in brutal sanctity. His hands hung relaxed at his sides, but every tendon, every vein beneath that calm skin screamed, with restrained violence, an orchestral symphony of power, waiting for the first downbeat. Brent's eyes shot up, and his breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. His gaze skittered till the crisp white paper crumpled in his fist. The word Special Investigator. Isaiah Cole stared back at him, each letter a death nail. His face drained of color so rapidly it looked as if someone had opened a valve inside his skull. He staggered backward, legs buckling, fingers clawing, for an invisible support that didn't exist. The paper fluttered from his hand, floating to the floor like a white flag soaked in defeat. Isaiah continued forward, his steps echoing like hammer strikes in a cathedral of guilt. He didn't raise his voice when he stopped inches away from Brent, didn't even bother to glance at the paper now lying like a corpse between them. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing into black crescent of unfiltered authority. Ready to apologize yet, Isaiah's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of 1,000 gravestones. Each word was a scalpel that carved Brent open from the inside, exposing the raw pulp of his cowardice. Brent's mouth twitched, his body jerking forward in a pathetic mimicry of fight or flight. His fingers flexed as if to reach for Isaiah's throat, but then, as if struck by an invisible wall, he froze mid-motion. His arms hung limp, trembling, each muscle fiber quivering under the sheer gravity radiating from Isaiah's stillness. Brent's knees bent, his body threatening to collapse entirely, but he remained caught in that purgatorial space between collapse and surrender. Isaiah watched every micro-expression with surgical interest, his head tilting slightly like a predator, analyzing the death rows of its prey. The room felt smaller, the walls creeping inward under the crushing intensity of Isaiah's presence. Brent's pupils dilated, his breath quickening into ragged, shallow gasps, each one a confession of defeat disguised as a survival instinct. Isaiah leaned in even closer. So close Brent could see the fine details in his irises, black voids that mirrored his disintegration. Then Isaiah spoke again, lower this time, so low that Brent had to strain forward, his head bobbing like a marionette to catch each syllable. "You will learn how to kneel properly," Isaiah murmured, each word sliding into Brent's ear like a poisoned blade. "And this time, no one is coming to save you." The last word detonated inside Brent's skull. He shuddered violently, his entire frame convulsing as though exorcising some vile spirit. But no release came. Instead, he remained locked in place, a puppet whose strings had been severed mid-performance. His eyes rolled upward, searching the ceiling for mercy that would never arrive. Isaiah stepped back, his composure intact, the badge catching the light once more as if to underline the finality of the moment. He observed Brent's trembling silhouette with a detached curiosity, as though inspecting the last dying ember of a long-dead fire. In that single gaze, the entire narrative inverted. Isaiah was no longer the silent victim beneath the knee. He was the executioner, the judge, the architect of poetic justice. The room itself seemed to exhale as Isaiah straightened, every molecule vibrating with the clarity of an irreversible verdict. Brent's knees finally hit the ground, a hollow, echoing thud that reverberated into eternity. His hands clawed at empty air, his mouth forming silent prayers, his spirit crushed under the inescapable weight of a truth he had long refused to acknowledge. Isaiah watched, his eyes unblinking, a living statue of judgment rendered in human flesh. No further words were needed. The silence, thick and absolute, became the final chorus, the ultimate requiem for a man who once believed he was untouchable. And as Isaiah turned to leave, his shadow fell across Brent like a guillotine blade, sealing the moment in a hush, more merciless than any scream. The echo of Brent's knees hitting the ground still throbbed in the hallways of the station as he stumbled, broken and gasping toward the bathroom. His legs barely obeyed, each step an ugly convulsion that dragged his body forward like a marionette. Tangled in its strings, the harsh fluorescence overhead flickered as though recoiling from the stench of his collapse. Shadows dancing and shrinking with each jittery movement. He shoved open the door so hard it slammed into the tiled wall, the crash reverberating like a funeral bell. He staggered to the sink, gripping the edges so hard his fingers turned bone white. His reflection staring back at him with the horror of a man confronted by a ghost. The mirror did not light night. It revealed the monstrous wreckage he had become. Eyes red and swollen, scars streaked like cracked porcelain, cheeks hollowed by panic and self-loathing, hair matted and clinging to his forehead, dripping sweat as though he'd been submerged in a nightmare. His chest rose and fell in jagged bursts, each breath more a sob than oxygen. Brent leaned closer, his nose nearly brushing the cold glass, pupils dilating, as he studied every flaw, every twitch, every evidence of the decay gnawing at his soul. With a guttural roar, he tore at his uniform, fingers clawing the buttons until they popped and scattered across the floor like shrapnel. He wrenched the shirt off, exposing a torso striped, with angry purple veins pulsing under sickly skin. In a frantic, almost ritualistic motion, he kicked the balled-up uniform across the floor, then stomped it again and again, the wet slap of his boots echoing with vicious finality. Each stomp was a scream without sound, a savage attempt to obliterate the badge that had once defined him, that had now become a noose. He dropped to his knees, scooping the crumpled shirt into his fists, shaking it violently as though it might confess some hidden sin. The patches tore, threads snapping like brittle bones, his fingers slipping on sweat and tears. Finally, he hurled the uniform away and scrambled back to the mirror, slamming both palms onto the glass, his forehead pressed against it, skin slick and trembling, breath fogging the surface until it blurred his reflection into something monstrous and formless. Then, without warning, the screen on the far wall flickered to life. The sterile quiet fractured under the sudden glow, and Brent's head snapped toward it, eyes wild and feral. Isaiah appeared, framed in cold clarity, his posture relaxed yet coiled, an executioner in the robe of a saint. His eyes gleamed with a depthless cold, a black ocean hiding storms only Brent would drown in. Isaiah tilted his head, lips curving into something too thin and precise to be called a smile. "You see it now, don't you?" Isaiah's voice slipped through the room like a scalpel, clean and devastating. "Your real face, the one you wore under the badge all along?" Brent screamed, a strangled, ragged wail that ripped up from his gut like barbed wire. He swung his fist, knuckles smashing into the glass. The mirror shattered with a sound like bones breaking underwater, shards clinging to his skin, embedding in flesh as blood fanned out in violent arterial arcs across the sink. The cracked surface fractured his reflection into 1,000 mocking fragments, each shard capturing a different angle of his agony, each piece a new witness to his unraveling. He stumbled back, hands dripping crimson, eyes darting between the shards and the screen, as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. Isaiah remained unmoving, the only steady presence in the maelstrom of Brent's self-destruction. "Blood won't cleanse disgrace," Isaiah intoned, his voice slower now, heavy as a tombstone lowered into the earth. "It only exposes it, makes it impossible to ignore." Brent dropped to the floor, hands clutching at his scalp, blood smearing across his face as he ran his fingers through his hair, leaving streaks of horror that dripped onto the tiles below. His screams had turned to pitiful sobs, each exhale punctuated by hiccuping gasps that made him sound less like a man and more like a dying animal. His knees scraped across shards of glass, cutting deeper gashes into already raw skin. Yet he barely reacted, the pain lost beneath the tide of psychic ruin crashing down on him. Isaiah's gaze did not waver, his head slightly tilted as if listening to some distant music only he could hear. The thin line of his mouth twitched occasionally, each micro-expression an autopsy report of Brent's final moments as a man. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing Brent's face as it twisted in defeat. Every nerve visible beneath the thin mask of humanity he had worn for so long. Brent crawled toward the uniform crumpled on the floor, his fingers inching forward, desperate to reclaim something, anything that might make him whole again. But even as he touched the stained fabric, he recoiled as though it were acid. his hands slapping the ground as he scrambled backward, legs tangling beneath him. He crashed against the wall, head bouncing once before slumping forward. Tears and blood mixed on his chin, dripped onto his bare chest, each drop echoing like a war drum in the sterile chamber. Isaiah exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the camera lens for a brief moment before clearing to reveal eyes sharpened to an almost inhuman focus. "Look at you," he murmured almost gently, stripped of the mask. "This is your true baptism, not in honor, but in your filth and cowardice." Ren's chest convulsed, lungs sucking air and shallow, uneven gasps. He pressed his forehead to the floor, body shivering violently, mumbling strings of incoherent apologies that dissolved into the tile. His hands dragged claw-like patterns in the blood and water, pulling beneath him, painting grotesque sigils of surrender and shame. Isaiah watched in silent ceremony, his expression the stillness of a midnight sea before a storm surge. Every blink, every breath from him felt measured, judicial, an ancient rite performed in modern steel and electricity. Brant curled further into himself, a man reduced to pure nerve endings and regret, a creature stripped of all pretense. In one final act of collapse, Brant lifted his head and turned toward the broken mirror. His eyes scanned the jagged shards, each piece catching a grotesque slice of his face. He saw himself multiply, saw the monster reflected again and again, a hydra of self-loathing no blade could sever. His mouth trembled, lips parting to form a question that never came, the words evaporating before they reached the air. Isaiah leaned forward, so close his breath could almost be felt across the screen. "There's no confession that will save you," he whispered, each syllable an icicle sinking into Brent's marrow. "You wanted to be God in that street light's glow. Tonight you find out what it means to be seen." Brant collapsed fully, face buried against the floor, arms wrapping over his head as if to shield himself from a rain of invisible knives. His voice disintegrated into sobbing tremors that rattled through the empty restroom like the final echoes of a dying bell. Isaiah's image on the screen didn't fade, didn't blink, simply watched. A monument to consequence incarnate, an inescapable sentinel in a cold and infinite courtroom of one. Brent's final whimpers in the shattered bathroom still echoed like an unholy hymn when dawn crept through the city, slicing the darkness with sterile, indifferent light. Hours later, those echoes trailed behind him as he was dragged, trembling and broken, toward a chamber that had never known such silence. The internal disciplinary hall of the department stood stark and cold, its walls scrubbed to a lifeless shine that reflected every twitch in Brent's battered frame. The heavy double doors swung open with a moan that sounded more like a grave unseeing than a courtroom invitation. Brant entered each step a discordant note in a requiem only he could hear. His uniform clung to his skin like wet parchment, its once proud fabric now marred with dark blood stains that spread in sickly blooms across his chest and sleeves. Every patch of insignia that once declared him untouchable now read as confessions, silent accusations stitched into the sea. Isaiah stood at the center of the chamber, his figure cloaked in an immaculate black vest that caught the overhead lights and fractured them into glacial shards. In his hands rested a thick dossier, edges crisp, papers stacked with ruthless precision. His eyes carried the weight of 1,000 verdicts, deep and unblinking, an abyss that mirrored no fear, no hesitation, only inevitability. The hush in the room felt alive, pressing against skin like invisible hands. Each chair remained empty. There was no jury, no audience. Brent would receive no sympathetic witnesses today. This was not a public spectacle. It was an execution, a ritual between predator and prey, and the walls themselves seemed to lean in, hungry to witness the unraveling. Brent's feet shuffled forward, each motion stuttering, as though the floor itself rejected his presence. He forced himself to straighten his spine, jaw clenching so violently. A vein pulsed against his temple like a trapped serpent. His eyes darted to Isaiah and then quickly away, skimming the sterile tiles, the ghostly reflections on the polished surfaces as if seeking a crack in reality to disappear into. Isaiah didn't move, didn't breathe in a way that Brent could detect. His presence was a monolith, casting a shadow larger than the chamber, a shadow Brent had no hope of escaping. The tension snapped when Brent finally found his voice, the sound scraping from his throat like shards of glass. "I was set up," he barked, hands trembling at his sides, fingers twitching in convulsions that betrayed his brittle defiance. His eyes bulged, bloodshot and raw, as if pleading with an invisible savior above. "I don't accept this. You hear me? I don't accept any of this." His voice ricocheted off the walls, returning to him thinner, weaker, stripped of authority with every echo. Isaiah remained unmoved. Slowly he raised the thick dossier, each page, a blade shimmering with the weight of truth. With a swift, decisive motion, he hurled it onto the central table. The pages fanned out like wings, sheets skidding across the surface in an eruption of damning confessions. The sound thundered through the room like a gunshot, making Brent flinch as though struck by an invisible hammer. Isaiah's eyes locked on Brent, twin voids that promised annihilation. "Every word you uttered," Isaiah intoned, voice slow, but echoing with a metallic resonance that settled deep into the marrow. "Every stump of your boot, every vile breath you wasted. You wrote your indictment long before you stepped into this chamber." His words coiled around Brent's neck, squeezing tighter with each syllable. Brent staggered, knees buckling, hands clawing at his collar as though the fabric itself had turned to iron shackles. His mouth gaped, lips trembling, but no sound emerged this time. Only dry, silent spasms twisted his features into a grotesque mask of disbelief and terror. Isaiah tilted his head slightly, the motion almost clinical, like a surgeon inspecting a specimen before the first incision. His gaze drifted to the blood blooming across Brent's chest, dark and iridescent under the harsh lights. The uniform now appeared less a garment of service and more a shroud soaked in penance. Isaiah's lips parted again, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow filled every corner of the vast hall. "You never needed a trial. You brought your gallows." He breathed, the words slipping past Brent's deflected stares and rooting straight into his core. Brent's shoulders collapsed inward, his body folding as if under an invisible anvil. His head dipped, eyes crashing to the ground, where splatters of blood mirrored his fall from illusion. One trembling hand rose to his neck, fingers curling around the collar in a pathetic attempt to hold himself together. But there was no structure left. He was a husk, a marionette with its strings hacked away, left only to twitch under the weight of its ruin. Isaiah stepped forward, each footfall deliberate and final, echoing across the tiles like coffin nails hammered in slow succession. Brent shrank further, head bowing so deeply it nearly touched his chest. His knees knocked together, bones clacking, with an athmic percussion that underlined his collapse. When Isaiah reached the table, he paused, surveying Brent with the gaze of a mountain, watching a landslide, vast, immovable, indifferent to the chaos below. He leaned over, fingertips brushing the edges of the scattered papers, each movement razor precise. His eyes never left Brent's cowering form as he slowly, deliberately stacked the sheets into a single towering pile again. Then, with a single motion as smooth as a guillotine blade, he slammed the stack flat against the table. The crack reverberated like a final heartbeat in a silent room. Brent jerked, shoulders spasming, breath seizing in shallow huffs. He lifted, his gaze one last time, eyes wide, irises floating in a sea of red veins. But this time no defiance flickered there, only a hollow echo of a man who had believed himself untouchable. His mouth opened, the beginning of a plea or a scream, but no sound was allowed to escape. Isaiah's gaze pinned him there, a spear of frozen judgment driven through the marrow of his spine. A final shudder coursed through Brent's frame before he crumpled entirely, knees crashing to the ground with a bone-rattling thud that echoed as a sentence more damning than any spoken word. His forehead dropped to the cold tile, hands twisting in front of him, clawing at the air for forgiveness that would never arrive. Isaiah watched in unwavering stillness, his expression unreadable, carved from an ancient cosmic certainty that dwarfed any courtroom verdict without a single additional word. Isaiah turned his back to Brent, the black vest cutting a silhouette that swallowed the light around it. As he stepped away, the echo of Brent's collapse remained, a dirge echoing in the hollow shell of a man who had once roared and now could only whimper. The chamber fell into a silence so absolute it seemed to bend sound itself, sealing the moment as a tomb seals its occupant, final and irrevocable. The final echo of Brent's collapse still pulsed in the chamber like a dying heartbeat when Isaiah's voice rose again, slicing through the stagnant air with clinical detachment. Brent remained crumpled at Isaiah's feet, his breathing ragged and shallow, each exhale a shuddering confession of defeat. Isaiah stepped forward, the black vest rippling, slightly as if alive, the badge gleaming like a blade catching moonlight. In one swift, cold motion, he dropped a heavy sheath of lined paper and a black ink pen onto the table before Brent, the sound reverberating like a gavel's final stride. "Right," Isaiah commanded, his voice devoid of warmth, each syllable dipped in acid. Brent flinched, head jerking upward, eyes wide and swimming with raw terror. His fingers clawed at the air as though trying to grasp a phantom rope that might pull him out of the abyss. Isaiah didn't move, didn't blink. He simply waited, patience as immutable as stone. The silence pressed against Brent's skull, a crushing vice that left no space for defiance. Finally, Brent's trembling hand reached out, fingers curling around, the pen like a man gripping a scalpel in a last-ditch surgery to save his rotten soul. The pen hovered over the first sheet, ink already bleeding onto the tip, a black tear ready to fall. Brent's fingers twitched violently, each joint cracking under the strain, sweat sliding down his forearms and dripping onto the pristine page. Below, his eyes darted to Isaiah one last time, silently begging for reprieve that would never come. Isaiah's gaze remained unbroken, pupils to pits of bottomless night, an abyss that consumed any plea before it could even form. "Write it big," Isaiah said, his voice low but resonant, slicing across the space like a whip. "Everyone will read it. You will read it hundreds of times until each letter brands itself into your marrow." Brent's throat clicked as he swallowed, a futile attempt to wash down the acid flooding his mouth. He pressed the pen to paper and the ink surged forth in a shaky, stuttering flow. The first letters trembled so violently they resembled the convulsions of a dying animal, jagged and uneven. Black ink spread and chaotic rivers pooling at the base of each letter, mirroring the arterial splatters from his earlier breakdown. He forced each word out as if wrenching shards of glass from his chest, the pen jerking across the lines in spasms that betrayed his total collapse. Halfway through the first line, Brent let out a strangled moan, shoulders buckling forward as though the weight of each confession was a millstone strapped to his spine. The pen slipped from his grasp, skittering across the table before clattering to the floor. Brent's hand shot after it, clawing desperately, nails scraping the wood as he caught it and dragged it back with the urgency of a drowning man clutching at a final breath. Isaiah took a single step closer, the echo of his polished shoes cracking through the tension like a bullet. Brent jerked, the pen almost flying from his grip again, his whole body convulsing with a terror so pure it smelled of iron and sweat. Isaiah leaned forward slightly, voice dropping into a rasp so intimate it felt like a blade drawn across Brent's ear. "What's wrong?" he asked, venom hidden behind mock concern. Too hard to hold the pen, he didn't seem to struggle holding a badge when you crushed others under your boot. Brent's head shook violently, his mouth opening to form a wordless, sobbing wail that sputtered and died in the thick air. His hands convulsed, each new line of ink weaving a tapestry of guilt and exposure that would outlive any apology. Tears blurred his vision, turning the letters into a morbid dance of ink and sweat. Yet he kept writing. Each stroke was a confession carved in real time, each blot a testament to his irreversible fall. "I can't do this," Brent finally choked out, his voice broken into splinters that scattered across the table, his eyes shot. up to Isaiah, feral and pleading. "I can't take this anymore." Isaiah's face didn't flicker. His eyes narrowed, glinting with a frozen precision that could fracture stone. He leaned in closer, lips curling into something so thin and cold it barely qualified as a smile. "You can't," he repeated, each consonant a hammer stroke. "Tell me, Brent, did you ever give them that option? Did you let them say 'I can't' when you forced their faces into the dirt? When did you spit on their humanity?" Brent's head thrashed side to side, a desperate animal gesture that only earned him more silence. Isaiah stood motionless, his presence an unyielding glacier pressing down on Brent's broken psyche. The pen trembled in Brent's hand again, ink dripping onto his lap like oil from a ruined engine. With a strangled whimper, he returned to the page, each letter now larger, messier, as though his shame had grown too monstrous to be contained by the lines. Hours seemed to stretch into eternities. As Brent wrote line after line, the ink pooling in grotesque constellations, his hand cramped into a twisted claw, knuckles swollen and red, veins crawling up his arm like black ivy. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation a battle, each exhalation a surrender. By the time the final line scarred the page, Brent's fingers were stained black, ink coating his nails and dripping down to mix with sweat and tears on the floor. He dropped the pen at last, its clatter echoing like the last clink of a closing cell door. His forehead slammed into the table, body convulsing in silent sobs that racked every brittle bone. His fingers twitched violently on the wood, clawing at invisible ghosts that would haunt him far beyond this chamber. Isaiah watched with the cold curiosity of a scientist documenting the final twitch of a dying specimen. He took one deliberate step forward, fingers brushing the edge of Brent's written confession. He flipped through the pages slowly, each turn as precise and cutting as a scalpel. His eyes scanned the ink-splattered lines without blinking, every word a testament to Brent's metamorphosis from predator to carcass. "Good," Isaiah murmured, voice low and final, vibrating through the marrow of the room. "Now read it." Brent's head jerked up violently, eyes wide and hollow, his lips parting in a silent scream. His body recoiled from the demand, spine arching as though struck by a whip. But Isaiah's gaze held him there, an invisible vice that brooked no negotiation. Brent's trembling fingers rose, grasping the edge of the first page, knuckles bone white. His lips stumbled over the words, voice cracking on every syllable, each phrase breaking against his teeth like waves on a jagged shore. Line after line, Brent's handwriting became a noose, tightening around his throat, the chamber filled with the hollow cadence of his recitation, a ghostly echo that spiraled into infinity. By the time he reached the final sentence, Brent's voice had dissolved into a hoarse rasp, more air than sound. His eyes flooded again, tears carving rivers through the grime and ink on his cheeks. When he finished, his body collapsed forward, forehead smacking the stack of pages, hands splaying out like the final twitch of a dying animal, fingers curled and uncurled in a final futile dance, each motion a micro-confession of the horrors he had authored and now embodied. Isaiah stood motionless, the black vest transforming him into a silhouette of divine judgment, a living monolith of consequence. In that moment, there was no audience, no applause, no absolution. There was only Brent, a man reduced to a pile of ink, sweat, and failure, and Isaiah, the unwavering sentinel who had overseen his final unraveling. No further words were needed. Brent's last whimper echoed one final time before fading into a silence so dense it might have been mistaken for eternity itself. The final echo of Brent's trembling voice, reading his damnation, still clung to the chamber like a poisonous fog when dawn cracked open the sky outside, spilling pale light onto a world that had not yet woken to his disgrace. Hours later, he found himself under that same indifferent light, his shoulders weighed down, not by the burden of armor or authority, but by a vest so bright it seemed to humiliate him with every fluorescent thread. The safety vest screamed against his skin. Former officer, repentance duty, a brand more searing than any iron. His hands clutched a cheap broom, bristles frayed and dirt slick. An object so mundane, yet now a scepter of shame. On his head sat a battered cap bearing the same damning inscription, its letters practically vibrating under the morning sun. Brent's spine curved forward, shoulders hunched as though trying to fold himself into the pavement. Every step along, the cracked sidewalk echoed like a confession. Each shuffle another page torn from the last remnants of his dignity. His boots dragged, rubber scraping against concrete, a sound that sliced through him more cry than any year could. His fingers twitched around the broom handle, grasping it like a drowning man might cling to driftwood. But there was no salvation here, only endless concrete, endless debris, endless eye. He avoided every gaze, each fleeting glance from passers-by landing on his raw nerves like hornets. Their expressions ranged from curious to contemptuous, some even snickering under their breath before moving on, leaving a trail of silent barbs embedded in his already shredded psyche. He kept his head low, eyes glued to the trash-strewn ground, praying for invisibility that would never come. His breaths came shallow and erratic, each exhale laced with a sob. He refused to let fully escape. His legs trembled beneath the weight of the words plastered across his chest, the reality of each letter more crushing than any physical chain. Isaiah watched from a distance, his frame half shadow, half statue, standing perfectly still near the intersection where light and shame collided. The black vest fit him like a tailored judgment, his eyes a polished obsidian that devoured every detail. He did not approach, did not speak, did not even shift his weight. The silence that surrounded him felt louder than any siren, vibrating through Brent's bones with a frequency that threatened to split him open from within. Each moment of Isaiah's gaze felt like a hand pressed against Brent's skull, forcing him further into the muck of his sins. Brent risked a glance upward, an involuntary twitch that dragged his gaze across the street to where Isaiah stood. The instant his eyes locked onto Isaiah's, his entire body jolted as though a bolt of electricity had shot through his spine. His legs buckled slightly, knees knocking together, the broom clattering against the curb before he snatched it back up with fumbling, panicked fingers. The urge to run surged through him in a tidal wave, a primal instinct roaring up from some animal corner of his mind, but his feet refused the command, froze into the asphalt as if the letters on his vest had rooted him in place. Isaiah remained still, only his eyes moving, tracing Brent's every tremor, every cowardly tick. A flicker of amusement, or perhaps just cold recognition, flared for an instant in his gaze before it settled back into an abyssal calm. Then, with a slowness so deliberate it felt like a blade drawn from a sheath, Isaiah tilted his chin downward. In a single decisive nod, the gesture cut through Brent more viciously than any shout could have. It was an execution delivered by the mere tilt of a head, a death sentence written in the language of disdain. Brent's breath seized in his chest, his throat closing around a sob that clawed upward but died in a pathetic gurgle. His hands spasmed, broom handle rattling in his grip like a gun in a rookie's trembling palm. His eyes remained locked on Isaiah, wide and empty, pupils floating in seas of red veins. He wanted to collapse, to evaporate, to become dust beneath the indifferent boots of the pedestrians who flowed around him like water around a rock. But no collapse came, only the slow, torturous unraveling of a man forced to live within a cage he had forged for others. Isaiah turned then, breaking the eye contact with a precision that felt like a guillotine blade falling. His shoulders remained square, movements liquid and unhurried as he stepped away, disappearing into the river of morning traffic without once looking back. Yet even in that retreat, his presence remained. A phantom hand wrapped around Brent's throat, squeezing with silent authority. Left alone, Brent's gaze stayed locked on the space where Isaiah had stood, lungs quivering as though he had been submerged underwater too long. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head dropped again, eyes sinking to the broom and the sidewalk littered with wrappers, cigarette butts, and the occasional broken bottle. Each piece of garbage felt like an accusation, waiting for his trembling hands to touch. He bent forward, back, arching into a grotesque parody of a bow, sweeping mechanically, the bristle scraping with an audible whimper against the concrete. Passers-by continued to glance, some pulling out phones to record, others shaking their heads in silent judgment. Each lens felt like a rifle scope, each head shake another nail into the coffin of his former self. His mind replayed Isaiah's nod, on an endless loop, each iteration shredding the last fiber of his defiance. Brent moved on autopilot, hands cramping and knees threatening to buckle. But no mercy came. He could not stop. He could not hide. This was his new reality, an endless parade of shame under the indifferent morning sun, forever haunted by a gaze that no longer needed to be present to control him. His reflection ghosted back at him in the windows of parked cars, a warped mirage of the man he used to be. The bright vest glowed like a wound against his skin, the words across his chest burning into his retinas until they felt seared into his soul. Former officer, repentance, duty. The phrase looped in his mind with a cruel rhythm, each repetition more corrosive than the last. His fingers tightened around the broom until his knuckles split, small rivulets of blood sliding down to mingle with the sweat and dirt coating his skin. He shuffled forward, oblivious to the city's heartbeat around him, deaf to the laughter, blind to the pity and scorn alike. There was only the endless street stretching ahead, and the shadow of a man who had left without needing to say a word. In that silence, Brent discovered a deeper punishment than any cell or courtroom could offer, a living death played out under the merciless gaze of a city that would never forget, and a man who no longer needed to be there to command his every breath. The fluorescent vest still clung to Brent's frame like a second skin of shame. As the city beyond his shuffling feet came alive with a new rhythm, a chorus of millions. By the time the sun stood high and cruel overhead, his confession video had metastasized across the country, spreading like an unstoppable wildfire that devoured every last hiding place he might have hoped for. Screens from coast to coast flickered with the same grotesque footage. Brent, a trembling husk of arrogance, forced to scrawl out his guilt in ink thick as coagulated blood, over 10 million views in the first day alone. No filters, no edits, just raw exposure, stripped of defense and pretense. In each share, in every forward, Brent's hollow eyes stared back at a public that dissected him with collective glee. Headlines spat phrases like fallen hero or exposed tyrant and confession of an unformed predator. Comment sections overflowed with venom and mockery, each keystroke a lash across his already flayed spirit. Memes sprang up overnight, his blood-streaked fingers clutching the confession sheets turned into viral jokes. His trembling lips, frozen mid-sab, became punchlines pasted across timelines, a grotesque echo chamber feeding on the rotting carcass of his reputation. Isaiah appeared in the footage only as a passing silhouette, a black vest sliding through the edge of the frame like the blade of an executioner glimpsed at the periphery of a nightmare. He never spoke, never posed, never offered a single statement to the hungry cameras. That silence only amplified the mythos. A phantom figure orchestrating retribution without needing to soil his hands with public commentary and punishment. His absence was more potent than any speech. His quiet presence glimpsed like a ghost felt as omnipotent as thunder rolling beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, Brent dragged his broom through alleyways and intersections, head drooping so low it seemed pinned by invisible nails. The words on his vest, once a private sting, now pulsed like a neon wound under the judgmental glare of the world. On the third day of his humiliating parade, he trudged past a familiar crosswalk, his steps heavy and uneven, as though each stride demanded the crushing weight of every view, every click, every laugh echoing through digital corridor. The car, his rusting old sedan now parked along a curb, had become a new canvas for the city's scorn. Across its battered doors and dripping violent red spray paint, someone had scrolled, "Liar pig," the letters oozed like open wounds. Each strip an accusation, each curve a scar. Brent froze, broom dropping to the ground with a hollow clatter. His breath hitched, chest convulsing as the words seared into his retina. A thin, pitiful whimper clawed its way up his throat, but died before it could take form. As if summoned by fate's cruelest timing, a small child paused on the sidewalk nearby, her hand entwined with her mother's. She stared at Brent, her innocent gaze cutting deeper than any blade, her head tilting in gentle curiosity. She raised a tiny finger, voice ringing out with the crystalline clarity of an untainted soul. "Mommy, why is that man crying while cleaning the street?" Her question hovered in the thick summer air, slicing through the last vestiges of Brent's fragile psyche. The mother tugged her gently along, face tight, eyes averted, but the question lingered, echoing in Brent's skull with a violence unmatched even by Isaiah's cold precision. The words looped endlessly. "Why is that man crying?" Brent's face drained of all remaining color, power crawling across his skin like frost on a dying leaf. His lips quivered, teeth chattering despite the heat rolling off the asphalt. His fingers scrabbled at his scalp, nails clawing through sweat and grime, hair sticking in jaggedness between his knuckles. He bent forward suddenly, arms wrapping over his head as if shielding himself from a hail of unseen stones, his knees buckling beneath him. The world around him blurred into a carnival of jeering phantoms, each passerby transformed into a tribunal of silent executioners. Every phone pointed in his direction felt like a loaded gun. Every whisper carried the weight of 1,000 condemnations. He rocked back and forth on the concrete, for at nearly scraping the ground, breaths coming in, tortured rasps that reverberated off shop windows and car doors. Above it all, the city pulsed on, indifferent and unstoppable. Traffic lights flickered, crosswalk signals chirped, horns blared. A symphony of normally that mocked the private apocalypse playing out beneath it. Brant's mind splintered under the weight of it, every sound amplified, every movement magnified, every unseen gaze turned into a scorching spotlight. He tried to shrink into himself, to vanish into some private abyss where the child's question could not reach. But there was no refuge, no darkness deep enough to hide him from the new social sun that had risen solely to burn him alive. Somewhere far beyond the noise and digital cacophony, Isaiah remained silent, a distant shadow that no longer needed to loom directly to maintain its omnipotence. His victory required no further words, no public gloating. Brent's very existence now functioned as an endless broadcast of his destruction. In every frame of every video, in every replayed confession, Isaiah's unseen hand hovered, pressing Brent's head deeper and deeper into the mire of communal hatred. The mother and child vanished into the crowd, leaving Brent crumpled and shivering in the harsh glare of midday. The painted words on his card gleamed with fresh malice, as though laughing at him in a voice only he could hear. He pressed his palms over his ears, sobs splitting his ribcage, echoing in the empty cavern where his pride once roared. Every bystander became a reflection of the child's innocent question. Each looked in a mirror, reflecting not just his failure, but the monstrous core he had spent a lifetime hiding. And so he remained there, an island of ruin in a sea of indifference and cruelty. A man once armored by a badge, now naked before a nation that had turned his confession into a rallying cry. A meme? A cautionary tale. The final sentence had already been spoken, not by a judge or executioner, but by the collective voice of a society that had no mercy to spare, only infinite memory and infinite appetite for the fall of the mighty. The echoes of Brent's sobs on the street had barely faded into the city's restless heartbeat when Isaiah emerged once more into the public eye, a phantom stepping from the shadows with a composure that turned every lens toward him as if magnetized by a silent, unyielding force. Reporters clamored beyond barriers. Microphones raised like weapons, begging for an answer, flashes crackling like electric storms. Yet when Isaiah stepped before the press, he carried no script, no prepared defense, no righteous fire, only an oceanic calm that seemed to swallow the entire street into a hush deeper than midnight. In one clean, resonant breath, Isaiah spoke, each word reverberating through the crowd like a bell tolling for a funeral no one dared attend. I will not pursue criminal charges, he declared. His voice iron-wrapped in velvet, only civil recourse. The words landed like meteorites, shocking even the most hardened cynics into a stunned silence. Brent, wherever he hid in that moment, felt the seismic shudder of that declaration rattle through his marrow. The cameras continued to click, but the world seemed to shift its axis around Isaiah's still-centered gravity. Across town, Brent collapsed into a folding chair in a dimly lit corner of a municipal store, the air stale and heavy with bleach and regret. The news hit him like a silent glacial wave. No prison bars would close around him, no gavel would thunder above his bowed head, and yet there was no relief in his tears. They flooded from his eyes with a violence born not of salvation, but of despair so deep it seemed to split him open from the inside. His chest caved inward, as sobs clawed up his throat, tearing at the walls of his composure until he resembled nothing more than a husk, a shell echoing with all the screams he had once inflicted on others. Damn you! The efficient enclave had been once his, for his mind looped Isaiah's words like a broken hymn. No prison, no legal execution, only the civil punishment. A punishment far crueler in its permanence, for it offered no finite sentence to serve and finish, no cell door to one day swing open. It was a life sentence of breathing under the crushing weight of his shame, a punishment etched into the architecture of his very soul. When Isaiah arrived later that day to meet him one final time, Brent struggled to rise, knees weak, head bowed, as though gravity itself sought to drive him into the earth. Isaiah stepped into the cramped room with an elegance that made the flickering ceiling light above seem suddenly reverent, as if even the shadows strained to listen. His vest was gone, replaced by a crisp white shirt that gleamed against the dimness like a blade's edge. His presence did not need words to command the air. It filled every molecule, pushed every oxygen atom against Brent's lungs until he struggled for breath. Brent lifted his head, and in that fleeting moment their eyes met, predator and prey, judge and condemned, infinity and insignificance. He opened his mouth, lips quivering, the faintest breath catching like a sob against his teeth, but Isaiah's voice cut through, soft yet weighted with a gravity that pressed down on Brent's shoulders like a mountain. Forgiveness is not forgetting, Isaiah said, each syllable articulated with surgical precision. Forgiveness is leaving you alive to wear this shame like a second skin. You will carry it through every corridor, every crowded street, every sleepless night. It is not absolution. It is a mirror you will never be able to shatter. Brent's eyes flooded again, tears spilling over his cheeks, sliding down to drip onto the grime-darkened floor. His body convulsed as he collapsed forward, knees crashing into the tile with a thud that cracked like a rifle shot in the silent room. He crawled, hands scraping the ground until his trembling fingers found Isaiah's polished shoes. His forehead dropped against them, smearing sweat and tears in a gesture both pathetic and primal. "I'm sorry," Brent gasped, the words stuttering, out like dying embers from a once roaring fire. I'm sorry, please." Isaiah looked down, eyes glacial, the muscle in his jaw ticking once in a restrained gesture of disdain. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, breaking contact, leaving Brent's hands clawing at empty air, his forehead falling forward to strike the floor with a dull, hollow echo. Isaiah's expression remained unreadable, carved from a serenity that held more menace than any shout or strike. "It's not me who needs your apology," Isaiah announced, his voice lower now, almost intimate in its finality. "It's you. You need it. You will spend the rest of your life chasing that absolution, and it will always be just beyond your reach." Ren's sobs erupted anew, echoing through the room like the cries of an abandoned child. His fingers spasmed on the floor, nails clawing into the tile as if he might tunnel his way out of the reality Isaiah had imprisoned him in. Each gasp choked and cracked, words failing to form under the avalanche of his realization. Isaiah turned, each step away from the collapsed man punctuated with a silence so absolute it howled in Brent's ears louder than any siren ever could. No final glance back, No words of mercy, only the echo of footsteps, fading into eternity. In that final cavernous quiet, Brent folded in on himself, a living monument to all the hatred and violence he had once embodied. His tears puddled beneath him, merging with the dust and filth of the floor until they reflected his shattered face in warped, mocking fragments. There, alone in the echoing dark, he discovered the true cost of his actions, not a jail sentence, but an unending exile inside his mind, and somewhere far above, beyond locked doors and silent corridors, Isaiah stepped into the afternoon light, his silhouette crisp and unwavering, a testament to power exercised not through violence, but through the merciless elegance of truth. Brent's hollow confession had barely dried on his lips when Isaiah carved a new chapter into his punishment, a sentence more suffocating than any cell could offer. He would not simply disappear into the shadows of disgrace. He would stand before bright-shade cadets year after year as a breathing relic of everything they must never become, a decade-long sentence to instruct the human dignity and ethics course, a stage where every word from his mouth would be a splinter driven deeper into the marrow of his broken spirit. The first day arrived like a cold dawn after a violent storm. Grant shuffled into the lecture hall a husk of the uniformed titan he once pretended to be. His hands shook as he clutched a stack of dog-eared notes, the pages stained at the corners by sweat and the ghosts of old ink. His eyes were sunken craters, black hollows where pride and bravado had once lived. Recruits filled the rows, their uniforms crisp, their faces expectant and unscarred. They eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled skepticism, some even smirking as they leaned back into their seats, arms folded across chests that would soon learn to breathe under the weight of a badge. Brent climbed the steps to the podium as though wading through wet concrete, each footfall echoing like a tolling bell announcing his funeral. The microphone stood before him like an executioner's blade. He cleared his throat, a brittle sound that snapped in the air before it even reached the microphone. His fingers flexed, tremors betraying an agony so intimate it shivered across the cavernous room. He looked up once, scanning the sea of fresh faces before his gaze crashed into Isaiah, seated in the very first row. Isaiah sat with a posture carved from marble, his hands folded neatly on the small desk before him, his eyes locked on Brent, with an unwavering stillness that bent the air around him. Each time Brent's eyes dared to lift, they collided with Isaiah's gaze, a silent collision that felt like colliding with a glacier mid-sprint. Isaiah gave nothing away, no smirk, no sneer, just an abyssal calm that watched, measured, consumed. Brent's voice cracked as he began, each word crawling from his throat like a dying insect. He read from the first line of his prepared remarks, the words dry and academic, meant to sound noble, but instead bleeding desperation with every syllable. His tongue stumbled on terms he once wielded like weapons: justice, authority, protection. Each one tasted of ash now, and each mispronunciation chipped away another sliver of his dignity. Isaiah's head tilted slightly every time Brent faltered, the smallest gesture, but one that sliced deeper than any heckle. The room itself seemed to shrink and stretch, every fluorescent bulb above buzzing louder, every seat creaking like distant groans in a Brent's hand wiped across his forehead again and again, smearing a sheen of sweat that shimmered beneath the harsh lights. He stumbled into the next section, the words turning heavier. His voice now no longer a teacher's, but a penitent's. Power, Brent read, his tone fragile as a thread about to snap. Is not the right to kill. He paused, lips parting, but no sound following. The silence yawned open around him, swallowing the room whole. His eyes jerked downward, and the paper trembled in his grip like a living creature trying to escape. Brant's shoulders convulsed once, a ripple of breath that turned into a muffled sob. A single tear, thick and slow, fell onto the page, smudging the ink into an ugly bruise across the text. Brent's throat quivered as he tried to reclaim the line, but his mouth hung open uselessly. The final syllable stuck between terror and regret. He glanced up one last time, and there Isaiah sat, still statuesque, a living verdict sculpted from bone-deep judgment. Isaiah shifted forward, pushing his chair back with a sound that split the room like a whip crack. His palms met each other, in a slow, deliberate clap. Once, then twice, then again, each strike echoing across the sterile walls like a gunshot echoing in an abandoned cathedral. The applause was soft, but carried a gravity so suffocating it pinned Brent's lungs to the inside of his ribs. No words followed, no nod of approval or sneer of contempt, just that measured glacial rhythm. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at Brent, others unable to meet Isaiah's gaze. The sound of the claps rippled through their bones, as if each pulse carried a silent warning from a future they had yet to meet. Brent's hands dropped to his sides, pages slipping from his grip and scattering like dying moths across the podium. He stumbled backward, his knees nearly giving, eyes glazed as though he might collapse under the weight of those slow final claps. Isaiah rose fully now, the simple act enough to draw every breath in the room to a standstill. He did not utter a single syllable, for his silence roared louder than any condemnation. The final clap echoed once more, the sound lingering in the air like the final toll of a funeral bell. Brent watched him, with pupils dilated to black oceans, his lips trembling in a silent plea that would never find a recipient. Then Isaiah turned, his back straight, shoulders squared, every movement a flawless stroke of mastery in an invisible war. He stepped toward the exit, each footfall deliberate and elegant, a slow march that felt more like a procession to an altar than a simple departure. The door creaked open as though protesting the absence of the force that had just passed through it, then closed with a decisive, almost ceremonial click. Brent stood frozen in the void left behind, surrounded by recruits whose eyes flickered with confusion, fear, and the glimmer of understanding. The lecture hall remained silent, the echo of Isaiah's clap still reverberating in the air, vibrating through Brent's bones. His head fell forward, shoulders curling inward, breath shallow and broken. He reached for the fallen pages, but only managed to brush them lightly before collapsing fully onto the podium, a crumpled monument to his ruin. Outside, Isaiah stepped into the sunlight, a faint breeze lifting the edges of his crisp white shirt. The sky above him stretched open and clear as if offering an unspoken acknowledgement of the balance restored. The final lesson had been delivered not through words, but through the profound silence of a man stripped bare before his would-be successors. A silence that would echo in each recruit's mind long after they left that hall, a slow, poisonous seed that would root itself and bloom with every future choice, every flex of power, every hesitation before pulling a trigger. The final lesson was never meant to be a speech. It was a living tombstone, and in that graveyard of illusions, Brent remained, a breathing epitaph, forever reciting the words that had damned him. As Isaiah vanished into a sunlit horizon that no longer required his voice to be heard, the slow, deliberate echo of Isaiah's final footsteps through the academy halls still vibrated in the marrow of every recruit when the world beyond those walls shifted in imperceptible ways. Isaiah stepped into the sunlight, his form a silhouette against the noon sky. The final arbiter who needed no further words to cement his dominion. Reporters flooded the gates, microphones thrusted forward like drawn swords, their questions slicing the air in chaotic waves. Mr. Call, what do you think of Brent's public response? Will there be further legal action? Do you have a message for the nation? Isaiah paused only once, his gaze sweeping across the sea of flashing lights and hungry eyes. He did not smirk, did not narrow his gaze. He merely let the hush build around him until even the wind seemed to lean in. Then, with a voice softer than a closing book, yet sharper than a guillotine's fall, he said, "Power speaks when silence ends." The words did not echo. They detonated, rippling outward into the ocean of microphones, headlines, and status updates that would become digital gospel before the hour was out. Then he turned away, his back straight, his stride unbroken, and vanished beyond the nod of cameras without another glance. leaving the world to ferment in his final phrase. Meanwhile, Brent continued his punishment in a different theater, one with no walls, no mercy, and no end. Every morning he trudged down the cracked sidewalks of the city, broom in hand, fluorescent vest glaring like an open wound against the concrete. But this was no longer just manual labor. It had become a public crucifixion, a daily pilgrimage of shame. Citizens recognized him immediately. Some shouted slurs, others merely raised their phones, the camera shutters clicking like the slow tightening of a noose. Each photograph splashed across networks within seconds, hashtags multiplying like vultures descending on a corpse. One viral clip showed Brent fumbling to pick up a crumpled soda can while a teenager live streamed laughing. Another showed an old man spitting at his feet. The captions varied from badge to broom, poetic justice in action, living cautionary tale, but all sang the same silent chorus. The world would never let him forget the old police station, once a fortress, where Brent had strutted through its halls like a demigod, now bore a new mural across its battered exterior. In enormous letters that bled down the cracked wall like a wound that refused to scab, someone had scrolled National Disgrace Lesson, and beneath it a single faded image of Brent's sobbing face, eyes hollow, mouth agape, and a silent scream that would echo across generations. Brent stumbled upon it one morning, broom clattering, to the ground as his fingers clawed the air helplessly toward the painted horror. His knees buckled, his lips parted in a tremor of horror, but no sound came. A small crowd gathered quickly, phones lifted high, some faces lit with glee, others with morbid curiosity. Brent fell forward, nearly touching the cold pavement, his hands spilled in a grotesque parody of prayer, as if hoping the asphalt might swallow him whole and spare him another sunrise. Each night, Brent returned to his decrepit apartment, a hollow room that smelled of mildew and dust, haunted by echoing headlines and spectral applause. In the far corner, a dusty mirror leaned against the wall, its glass so clouded that it no longer offered a true reflection, a mercy he clung to with white-knuckled desperation. One evening, after another day of public degradation, Brent lifted the mirror from the floor and hung it carefully on a crooked nail above the sink. His fingers lingered on its edges, trembling violently as he considered the possibility of facing himself. But when he leaned in, when his breath fogged the glass, in shallow, shuddering clouds, he recoiled at the ghostly shapes that began to form. He stumbled backward, a strangled cry caught between his teeth, palms flying up to cover his face. The mirror remained there, unchallenged, a silent judge awaiting the courage Brent would never muster. Far across the city, Isaiah sat alone in his office, a single desk lamp casting a sharp pool of light that turned the darkness beyond into a void. Before him lay Brent's thick, battered file, pages frayed and stained from months of handling. Isaiah flipped through it slowly, each page a silent monument to the systematic dissection of a man who once believed himself untouchable. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned each paragraph with the finality of a closing coffin lid. When he reached the final page, Isaiah's fingers hovered for a moment, as though savoring the final note in a symphony only he could hear. Then, with a quiet exhale that seemed to draw all tension from the room, he closed the file, pressing it flat against the desk. His hand slid across its surface, the motion as delicate and decisive as a blade's final sweep. He stood, spine straight as a blade, and reached for the lamp switch. "Done," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel of final judgment rendered in a language beyond law and punishment. The light flicked off, and the room swallowed him in out darkness. The file now nothing more than a silent relic of a man's total collapse. Outside, the city pulsed and thrived, unaware that somewhere in its underbelly, a man dragged a broom as though dragging his corpse behind him. And overhead, that single phrase, "Power speaks when silence ends," lingered in the air like a storm front, forever redefining the balance of justice and humiliation in a world addicted to both spectacle and consequence. The final snap of Isaiah's office lamp had barely dissolved into the shadows when the first light of morning crept over the city's rooftops, dissolving the residue of the long, suffocating night. Isaiah stepped out into the dawn, the air crisp and electric, as if the entire world had paused to inhale with him. Today, he wore no vest, no badge, no armor forged from official titles or veiled threats. Instead, a simple white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal forearms taut with a quiet, coiled power. It was the first morning in what felt like an eternity that his shoulders rested free of the invisible weight he had chosen to carry for so long. He stood still for a moment at the edge of the street, feeling the sun break over his face like a gentle, forgiving hand. His eyes fluttered shut, his lips parting as he drew a long, deliberate breath into lungs that had for years only known the sharp tang of conflict and anticipation. When he opened them again, the city lay before him, not as a battlefield, but as a canvas, newly washed by the dawn. He tilted his head back slightly, eyes tracing the pale orange and soft blue bleeding into each other above the horizon, and for the first time a genuine smile stretched across his lips, quiet and easy, as though it had been waiting patiently in some hidden chamber of his soul. Justice is not revenge. It is a reminder, he whispered to himself, the words slipping free like a final confession to the morning air. The phrase felt light on his tongue, but resonated with the density of 1,000 silent verdicts, drifting upward to mingle with the rising sun. It was not a mantra of vengeance, nor a slogan to be chanted and weaponized. It was a living seed meant to grow in every heart it touched, subtle yet indelible. With a smile to pass the time, justice is lived in many hearts. He pointed his hand at the rippling waters. Across the plaza, Brent stumbled into view, a wraith staggering under the cold, merciless scrutiny of a city that no longer even needed to point fingers or hurl words to break him. His shoulders slumped so far forward that they seemed to be dragging him into the pavement. His eyes, sunken and raw, flicked up only when they were forced, scanning for threats that no longer needed to announce themselves. He carried nothing now, no broom, no badge, no false armor, only the echo of a legacy that had metastasized into an endless gnawing ache. Their eyes met across the silent square, and in that single connection 1,000 chapters closed and reopened. All at once, Brent's lips parted, his jaw working as if to form some final plea, but no sound rose, his throat constricted around phantom words, muscles twitching helplessly beneath his sallow skin. He took half a step forward, the motion fragile, like a bird testing a broken wing, but then he froze, rooted to the spot by a force stronger than any law, the immovable gravity of Isaiah's quiet absolution. Isaiah observed him for a heartbeat that stretched into infinity. And then he dipped his chin in a single slow nod, not of forgiveness, not of reconciliation, but of final acknowledgement. The gesture carried neither warmth nor scorn. It was an affirmation that Brent had finally been seen, not as a monster or martyr, but simply as what remained when all illusions had been incinerated. Isaiah turned away with the same calm authority that had haunted Brent. For years, his spine straight, his steps measured and unhurried. He did not glance back, did not pause to savor the sight of his adversary unraveling under the morning sun. The message had already been carved deep into the city's bones and into Brent's shivering marrow. There was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove. Each footfall into the soft hush of dawn echoed like the distant beat of a drum, signaling the end of a war and the beginning of something pure, something unburdened. Behind him, Brent's knees gave way, his entire body folding in on itself until he crumpled to the cold concrete, forehead pressing against the street as if trying to merge with its unforgiving surface. His hands flew to his face, clawing down his cheeks, smearing salt and snot and regret and thick trembling lines. No scream erupted this time, no final protest ripped from his lungs. Only a hushed animal whimper that died the moment it touched the air. The city moved around him without pause, life flowing past his collapse as though it were nothing but another crack in the sidewalk. Isaiah stepped forward into the day, each breath smoother than the last, each movement carrying the hush of a man who had finally put down his sword without surrendering his strength. His legacy would not be etched in courtroom victories or viral footage, but in the silent shifts of hearts and minds that carried his final words forward. The reminder lived now, not in Isaiah's hands, but in the subtle choices of every soul who had witnessed the fall, every quiet hesitation before a shout, every pause before a swing of power. And as he moved further away, the sun climbed higher, gilding the tops of buildings, catching in the corners of windows, and turning the air into shimmering veils of light. Brent remained a blot of anguish on the city's canvas, a permanent footnote to a new chapter that had no room for his brand of arrogance and violence. Isaiah never looked back. The day had already claimed him, pulling him forward into its luminous promise. His shoulders rose and fell with an ease he had long denied himself, and for the first time in countless battles, he felt entirely alive. A new day had come, and with it a legacy reframed not in revenge, but in the stark, unyielding mirror of truth. And in that final divergence, two lives separated irreversibly, one ascending quietly into light, the other sinking silently into an endless self-made night. The first golden fingers of morning stretched across the city's spine as Isaiah moved through the station, the soft roll of his suitcase wheels whispering like secrets against the gleaming marble floor. He carried no fanfare, no retinue of followers or cameras, just a single small case and a presence that seemed to ripple through the air in quiet seismic waves. His white shirt gleamed under the early light, crisp and unburdened. Sleeves rolled neatly above forearms that bore the soft scars of silent wars. His eyes remained steady, focused beyond the crowd, tracing a line only he could see, a horizon that waited like an unfinished sentence. At the terminal gate, he paused, inhaling the metallic scent of rails and electric anticipation. Without turning, he slid a slim folder from his suitcase, laying it gently on the bench beside him. Across the cover, scrolled in clean, unwavering ink, read the words, "What you see is not me. It is you in the mirror." The phrase pulsed with a quiet gravity. Each letter an invitation and an indictment, a mirror polished by countless acts and confession. Isaiah's fingers brushed the folder one last time, his touch feather light as if closing a chapter in a book only he had fully read. Then, without a backward glance, he picked up his suitcase and continued toward the boarding platform, his footsteps dissolving into the hush of the waiting hall. Somewhere else in the city's underbelly, Brant found the folder hours later, fingers trembling as they skimmed across the inked words. His breath stuttered, lips parting as if to form a protest, but nothing came except a wheezing exhale that rattled against the echoing silence of the deserted terminal. His eyes darted over each line, pupil shrinking and dilating like a creature trapped beneath a microscope. He gripped the edges until his knuckles bloomed white, sweat bleeding down his temples, dribbling into the corners of his eyes. The folder wasn't heavy, yet Brent's arm shook as if he were lifting the weight of an entire lifetime of concealed sins. The words wormed into him, coiling around the last fibers of his self-deception, stripping each layer with slow, agonizing precision. On the platform, Isaiah boarded the train, each step measured, final, yet open-ended in its quiet authority. He stowed his suitcase, settled into the window seat, and turned his gaze outward. The glass reflected his face in fractured shards, each fragment catching a sliver of light, each angle telling a different story. His eyes scanned those shards, and for a moment, a thin smile curved his lips, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement, as though he had finally met all versions of himself in that fragile, temporary gallery. He leaned his forehead lightly against the window, feeling the gentle tremor as the engine roared to life below. Outside, the city began to blur into smears of color and shape, a living mural in motion. Isaiah's breath fogged the glass, the condensation trailing down like soft tears that never quite fell. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, each motion a private cadence echoing in the hollow chamber of the carriage. Meanwhile, Brent's voice finally fractured into a dry, guttural sound, somewhere between a gasp and a wail as he read and reread the words on the folder. His knees buckled, his body collapsed onto the station floor, and the folder was clutched to his chest like a cursed relic. His head dropped, eyes squeezing shut against the vision of his reflection. Each breath, a shuddering testament to the prison he had built, brick by brick, lie by lie, a scare in the depths of his mind. One single sentence churned, an unrelenting refrain: kneeling is not bowing. It is the moment before you stand. The line echoed against the walls of his skull, shattering what little composure remained, a blade that turned with each echo until it left nothing but raw, quivering flesh. Back on the train, Isaiah's eyes softened, gaze sinking beyond the horizon and into a quiet yet infinite unknown. No crowds cheered his departure, no banners declared his victory. His legacy whispered through empty spaces, echoed in trembling hands and second thoughts, in the hesitation before a violent order, in the heartbeat that quickens before a reckless decision. He had become a living question, a mirror held up not to absolve, but to challenge, to force each soul to confront the darkness lurking beneath their polished surfaces. As the city receded behind him, Isaiah's reflection splintered once more in the train's window, each broken piece catching a new dawn's light. The final image was neither villain nor savior, but a mosaic of choices, each shard a silent testament to the truth that power is never singular and justice is a journey without an end point. He closed his eyes, the train slipping further into the horizon, the wheels humming a low eternal mantra that seemed to murmur through the metal and glass. This is not the end, this is the echo. In that unresolved cadence, Isaiah's story drifted into legend, carried not by headlines or statutes, but by whispered doubts and quiet reckonings that would unfold in the private chambers of every onlooker's heart. And somewhere far behind Brent lay folded on the station floor, the folder still pressed to his chest, the final echo of Isaiah's words still tumbling through his mind like a phantom pulse. In the weeks that followed, Brent's torment took on new shapes beneath the harsh fluorescence of grocery store aisles, where shoppers filmed him stuffing expired cans into paper bags, while children giggled nearby, their parents too busy capturing his misery on shaky screens to intervene. In another corner of the city, an artist painted his face onto a massive brick wall contorted into a grotesque mask of fear. And each night, passers-by hurled eggs and beer bottles at it until the colors bled like an open wound under moonlight. On crowded subways, commuters whispered curses under their breath, shoving him violently as he clung to the rail, his eyes flicking wildly for a kindness that would never arrive. Each shove a staccato verdict that hummed beneath the chatter of the moving train. At a small roadside cafe, a group of strangers tore into a newspaper that bore his image, slicing it into confetti before tossing the scraps into his lap. There, laughter rising like a cruel choir against the brittle hum of neon signs overhead. His mouth opened in a silent plea that would never cross the platform to reach the man who had already vanished into the waiting dawn. Thus the story refused to close its door. It remained open, pulsing, alive, a mirror waiting in every eye.